Welcome to the Grand Theft World podcast, hosted and sponsored by the fine members over at grandtheftworld.com. You can check out our members area. We'll talk about that later. Tonight, coming up on episode 124 on this March 19th, 2023.
This portion of CBS This Morning sponsored by Pfizer.
Oh. Good Morning America is brought to you by Pfizer.
CBS Health Watch sponsored by Pfizer.
Anderson Cooper 360. Brought to you by Pfizer.
ABC News Nightline. Brought to you by Pfizer.
Making a difference. Brought to you by Pfizer.
CNN Tonight. Brought to you by Pfizer. Early Start. Brought to you by Pfizer. Friday night on Aaron Burnett Out Front. Brought to you by Pfizer.
This Week with George Stephanopoulos is brought to you by Pfizer.
Today's countdown to the royal wedding is brought to you by Pfizer.
And now a CBS Sports Update brought to you by Pfizer.
Meet the Press Data Download brought to you by Pfizer.
This portion of CBS This Morning sponsored by Pfizer.
On how to find the hidden sugars in the American family diet. Sponsored by Pfizer.
Donald Trump. He got reinstated on YouTube and Facebook this week. So that's a win in the Trump camp. Unfortunately, it appears, according to Trump, he's going to be arrested on Tuesday. So we're going to see how that shakes out. Can they arrest him? Will they hold him? Will he be prosecuted? Will he ever see prison? We don't know, but we'll stay tuned and we'll check out what kind of propaganda and psychological warfare they're dropping on folks.
Good evening, and thank you for joining us. U.S. presidential history could be made this week. That's if former President Donald Trump is indicted by a Manhattan grand jury following an investigation into hush money paid for an alleged sexual encounter with Stormy Daniels. In social media posts this weekend, Mr. Trump referred to the allegations as old and fully debunked. He also implored supporters to save America, calling on them to protest.
As we unfold the news of the week over the next several hours, we're going to bring reasonable views to the irrational news. We're going to break open each story. We're going to go into context, a little deep dive if we need to understand how people are being gaslit. Yes, that's a phrase. That's the past tense of gaslighting, the verb. How people are being gaslit. And by understanding the nature of the propaganda, then we can come to insights to make better judgments, decisions, and choices in our life. And we can live a lifestyle of freedom, independent of irrational, ignorant people doing their best to disrupt our lives. We also have stories like SVB, Silicon Valley Bank. We talked about it last week. There was a deep dive into Town Hall this week. If you're a Grand Theft World member, there's several hours of analysis, but also it had some domino effects, and it affected Credit Suisse, one of the two big Swiss banks, the other being UBS. So now UBS is going to buy Credit Suisse for like pennies on the dollar. It's on the chopping block, but I think it's an ominous sign of things to come. And during change, they want to make change. They're going to introduce a CBDC at some point. We're going to see how that shakes out.
So Friday, Silicon Valley Bank collapsed after widespread industry panic caused a run on the bank. Now try to put your disdain for elitist Silicon Valley censor czars aside, and let's take a look at the bigger picture of what's happening, because it's incredibly frightening. Essentially, the government is seeking to gain greater control over big tech, which will ultimately mean greater control over us. Now, we've seen what was revealed in the Twitter files, how the government infiltrated the big tech platform to censor Americans. We've seen how rollouts of things like ESG scores are being used to force companies to comply with a certain agenda or else. Now, the government seizures of Silicon Valley Bank and subsequently the Signature Bank of New York should set off loud, blaring alarm bells. Over 90% of tech startups bank with Silicon Valley Bank. And interestingly, Coinbase, the largest crypto exchange in the U.S., just announced mere days ago its move to Signature Bank of New York. And then the government seized it. You want to control someone? Control their money. And do you know what the government blatantly states they want to do? Control big tech and control crypto. Coincidence? It's important to understand that Silicon Valley Bank was not insolvent. It was illiquid. There's a difference. Illiquid means it couldn't come up with the cash customers demanded at that very moment. And the reason they couldn't was because suddenly about 20 to 25% of the money the bank managed was being demanded by customers all at once. Now, no bank in America could handle that sort of demand. Any bank would go under in the event of a run of that magnitude. Unlike the banks in the 2008 crash, SVB didn't invest in risky assets or make bad loans with its customers' money. It actually did one of the least risky and supposedly safest things you could do with excess customer cash. It bought treasury bonds. Treasury bonds are guaranteed if you wait till maturity. Now, lots of banks hold bonds. In fact, the Fed recently encouraged banks to buy them rather than lend customer cash in order to get cash out of the system and into reserves in hopes it would reduce inflation. So many banks bought bonds. The Fed encouraged them by giving those banks who did what the Fed asked favorable status. Don't make loans or investments with customer deposits. That would just inject money into the system, causing further inflation. Instead, buy bonds so that the money is tied up somewhere else, which would then reduce inflation. Well, it tied up the money all right. On top of giving the Fed their customers' money at the behest of the Fed then raised interest rates rapidly. That meant that those bonds were no longer worth what the banks paid for them. Now, that's one way to discourage a bank from coming along and cashing them out. Suddenly, Silicon Valley Bank needed that money back, but the bonds the Fed sold them were now worth less because the Fed devalued them. And the run got started because billionaire investor Peter Thiel saw the bank was over-leveraged in bonds and called companies in his portfolio to strongly suggest that they bail out and bail out fast. Now, the bank actually would have been okay if the run hadn't happened, or if the Fed actually did what the Fed was supposedly created to do, which is help prevent bank runs by injecting liquidity into a solvent bank when too many customers are demanding too much money all at once. The Fed injects liquidity into solvent banks all the time to help them out when needed. One question we should be asking is, why didn't the Fed do it for this solvent bank this time? Why did the Fed let this solvent bank fail? Again, it wasn't because this bank made risky investments or bad loans. This bank bought bonds, lots of them, from the Fed. Now, the Fed has the power to pick and choose when to help a bank and when to let it fail. And this was a bank with good assets and great clients. In fact, the biggest banks, the very banks who are the shareholders of the Federal Reserve, coveted the clients of SVB for a very long time and wanted nothing more but to gain Silicon Valley's business. And now they can, because Silicon Valley Bank is gone. Now there will be further consolidation of smaller banks into the larger ones, making it all that much easier to roll out a central bank digital currency and social credit score for us all. Again, you want to control someone, control their money, and that's ultimately the end goal.
Is it a coincidence that the same banksters, gangsters, tiny hats and pettas and warmongers that demolished the economy in 2008 are the same exact people back here doing it again 15 years later?
No, it isn't a coincidence. But why stop at 2008? As real conspiracy realists will know, this isn't 2008 Redux. This is 1907 Redux. More on which in a moment. But take a deep breath. James, hold my beer. I'm going to condense a 1-hour Corbett Report podcast down into a 5-minute New World Next Week segment. So, here we go. On the CBDC note, I will point out the fact that the A3 podcast has just, as I am speaking here, as we're recording this, just a few hours ago, published a podcast on this exact scenario. CBDC is going to arrive next month. Are you ready? And he lays out point by point how the bank run contagion can spread in a way that will then be used to proffer that prearranged solution. It's worth checking out. I'll include it in the links in the show notes. But okay. All right, I guess the first order question that we have to tackle here is, what was SVB? What really was it? And that question is answered by Wall Street on Parade, aka Pam and Russ Martins, who says Silicon Valley Bank was a Wall Street IPO pipeline in drag as a federally insured bank. And they have a great article up on this that goes through how this was a Wall Street IPO machine that enriched the investment banks on Wall Street by keeping the IPO pipeline moving. It padded the bank accounts of the venture capital and private equity middlemen, and it minted startup millionaires for ideas that often flamed out after the companies went public. This was an incredibly inherently risky investment bank. The fact that it was that it held a federally insured banking charter and was backstopped by U.S. taxpayers is ridiculous. But even more ridiculous, as they go on to point out in that really important article, they found that there was a sort of a secret bailout that was going on of SVB last year through the Federal Home Loan Bank of San Francisco, which pumped $15 billion into SVB as of December 31st, 2022. $15 billion should be ringing some bells because that's the exact amount of unrealized losses that the bank reported on January 19th. But anyway, sort of the secret bailout going on, which makes no sense because the Federal Home Loan Bank is supposed to be for promoting mortgages to individuals and loans to promote affordable housing and community development, not for bailing out this Silicon Valley venture capital investment bank, piggy bank, that they were using for tech startups, pharmaceutical startups. Ginkgo Bioworks had a lot of money in there. That's a name that should ring some bells for people. Climate tech startups, a lot of this woke green nonsense that was never going to pan out, but hey, you can ka-ching on all the way to the Silicon Valley Bank, right? So, but don't worry, guys. The investors got out just in time, right? What investors? Oh, like Peter Thiel, of course, as people probably know by now, but also, as the broken clock that's right twice a year at The Intercept will tell us, Gavin Newsom. Yes, cheering Silicon Valley Bank bailout. Gavin Newsom doesn't mention he's a client. At least 3 of the California governor's wine companies are held by SVB, and a bank president sits on the board of his wife's charity. What a beautiful, incestuous little circle that is. So I guess the question is, how did this happen? What really happened to precipitate this? Because, as I say, they reported on January 19th, $15 billion in unrealized losses, which is kind of a big deal for a bank. But actually, the next day, the stock price went up 16%. Yay! Those great, real hard-edged stock analysts decided, hey, that sounds like a winner. Let's bet on that. The bank passed its stress tests. It passed its FDIC examinations. It passed a financial audit by KPMG the week before it went under. It passed its state regulatory audits. So what happened? What really caused this bank run crisis? Oh, as it turns out, prominent venture capitalists advised their tech startups to withdraw money from Silicon Valley Bank, while mega institutions such as JP Morgan Chase & Co. sought to convince some SVB customers to move their funds. So you have this double whammy of people saying, hey, get out of this bank, they're going under, and JP Morgan and others going, hey, come over here. And as is now being reported, who are the immediate big beneficiaries of this? Well, get it from no less an authority than the Financial Times. Large U.S. banks inundated with new depositors as smaller lenders face turmoil. Yep, all these regional banks are suddenly in stress, and people are flocking to JP Morgan, Citigroup, the big name banks.
Now we have other stories like Facebook. They're not just some place that Trump just returned to. They're some place that's firing 10,000 of their workers. So if you're looking for employees who used to work at Facebook for Zuckerberg, there's going to be a lot of them on the market in the next couple of weeks. Also, Fauci getting in hotter water. He's got some interesting views in his post-retirement. He spends a lot of his time at home, apparently bending the meanings of words and phrases so that he can obfuscate his role in the world's biggest pandemic and maybe the world's biggest murder and crime scene, because a lot of people died from COVID. And it's not just Fauci blocked the information. It's that Fauci blocked the information and put out false reports and put out a smokescreen because he was, and groups working with him were funding work that went on that lab that CDC Director Redfield last week said likely leaked from that lab. And because it's a specific gain of function thing that doesn't happen in nature and does happen according to DARPA documents and documents we might dig into tonight, as a matter of fact, there's a much tighter story to be had that's not being circulated even now in the mainstream media.
To the topic today is the issue of pandemic preparedness. And if there's one message that I want to leave with you today, based on my experience, and you'll see that in a moment, is that there is no question that there will be a challenge to the coming administration in the arena of infectious diseases, but also there will be a surprise outbreak.
I don't know how many times I can say it, Madam Chair. We did not fund gain-of-function research to be conducted in the Wuhan Institute of Virology.
Anyway, so let me just go on about NIH lifts funding pause on gain-of-function research that might be anticipated to create transfer, or use enhanced potential pandemic pathogens. I don't think this is going to be foolproof. Things are going to slip through.
If it may have been a lab, may have been nature, we're supposed to look forward, then why did Dr. Fauci work so hard for just one of those theories?
I'm almost have to laugh at that, Neil. I mean, that's totally bizarre. First of all, I wasn't leaning totally strongly one way or the other. I've always kept an open mind.
As you know, there's a sort of urban legend that there's a biological warfare center in Wuhan and that the coronavirus escaped from that. Did you have any sense of where it probably came from?
I think ultimately we know that these things come from an animal reservoir. I've heard these conspiracy theories, and like all conspiracy theories, they're just conspiracy theories.
I wasn't leaning totally strongly one way or the other. I've always kept an open mind.
Very, very strongly leaning towards this could not have been artificially or deliberately manipulated.
Now, we think it's more likely that it was a natural evolution.
This is very, very likely a jumping species from an animal host, perhaps through an intermediate host, into a human species, which then spread throughout the human population.
So Dr. Anthony Fauci is trying to backtrack from all of the times he said COVID didn't come from a lab. And he's twisting himself into a pretzel.
A lab leak could be that someone was out in the wild, maybe looking for different types of viruses in bats, got infected, went into a lab, and was being studied in the lab, and then it came out of the lab. But if that's the definition of a lab leak, Jim, then that still is a natural occurrence.
So we all know where the Wuhan virus came from.
But I chaired a commission for The Lancet for 2 years on COVID. I'm pretty convinced it came out of U.S. lab biotechnology, not out of nature, just to mention after 2 years of intensive work on this. So it's a blunder.
So that's what happened. And that's the official, that's from The Lancet, right? The most prestigious, blah, blah, blah. That guy studied it intensely for 2 years. Jeffrey Sachs. It came from U.S. biolabs.
And by the way, Jon Stewart looked at it for 2 seconds and could tell that it came from the lab.
That's right.
It really...
anybody who's looked at this knows it came from a lab.
It's like internet censorship. We all knew.
And the reason why I say this is because the New York Times is doing it again. They're lying to you. Just straight up making stuff up. The New York Times, the origin of the COVID pandemic, what we know and don't know.
Here's what I know. If you're even saying it's a possibility, I mean, it is that. Because low confidence, why are you saying it? Why are you even saying it?
Wait till you see. Wait till you see what they say. A team of researchers has added fuel to the bonfire by presenting data at a World Health Organization meeting suggesting a wild animal known as a raccoon dog.
Why didn't you say man, bear, pig?
OMG. It's not oh my goodness. It's the OKeefe Media Group. So Project Veritas ousted its founder, James O'Keefe. He has relaunched his operation this past week.
The irony of the Acorn story is that it took a 25-year-old with a hidden camera a few days to do what billion-dollar networks and journalists could not do in a decade. I spent 14 years creating the most effective nonprofit newsroom this country has ever seen. And in paving the way to establish citizen journalism, I have been defamed, arrested, raided, and ultimately removed from the organization I spent so much time developing credibility of. I always knew they would try to ruin the reputations of those who expose them, the pharma giants, the three-letter government agencies, and those who I thought I could trust. But in response, we are going to build an army of investigators and exposers. They have awakened a sleeping giant. I'm back. Remaining by my side are a small, tight-knit group of the most elite journalists in the world. Exposing corruption requires standing up to power because power hates sunlight. We are sunlight. Welcome to the OKeefe Media Group, where we will never be shut down because not only do I own it, but you own it too. Support us and sponsor our army of journalists by becoming a founding member today.
And in similar stride, Steven Crowder has relaunched his mug club.
Controversial YouTuber named Steven Crowder. It's very offensive. Very expensive.
We have a higher standard for monetization.
YouTube dragged its feet before taking any action against conservative commentator Steven Crowder.
We did announce the monetization change that Steven Crowder was.
And it is crying. I don't like it. It's a total bitch move.
The conservative demographic it's quite literally dying off. There are a lot of people out there like me, like Joe, like our audience, who often feel like they don't have a home. They're misfits. They're not tuning into Fox News. They're not tuning into a lot of AM radio. It used to be content generators, right, who were adding the value to YouTube. Go and listen to most of the podcasts out there right now. It is far more PG, vanilla, Disney friendly than what you would hear on basic AM radio. And there's no FCC.
YouTube demonetizing conservative comedian Steven Crowder. They said he didn't violate their policies, but they were going to demonetize him anyway.
YouTube, Facebook, at one point Twitter, these guys should be in the hot seat. It shouldn't be refreshing. It shouldn't be the exception to the rule. It should be the rule.
I think Steven Crowder might have just revolutionized the way you negotiate contracts from this moment on. I'm being dead serious.
If you want to be with big tech, that's fine. My issue is don't claim that you're fighting big tech and then do their bit.
Steven Crowder said, sleep well, tomorrow is war. It's war! They're literally using this word, civil war, war.
And I mean that we are in an ideological war. We really are. We are at a potential tipping point in this country. Who are you reaching if it's not the truth? And Rumble is willing to gamble and let the cards fall where they may and allowing the truth to stand on its own. People are looking for folks to fight for them.
What you need, word team not alone. You can watch other shows from the cloud, cause I'm a blues make it all alright, now without a fight, no clubs everything.
You know what? It. I'll do it. My show will be Mug Club now. How about that? I can't do the walking thing. I don't have a tux. I got a onesie that looks like a tux.
What's a mug all alone? I know just what you need. Word team not alone. You can watch other shows from the cloud, cause I'm a blues.
So there's new entrepreneurial freedom endeavors that are fighting back against the corporate mainstream media narrative and structure of how they incentivize and penalize people who produce content. Last but not least, we got Luke Radowski. He's going to help us with the kickoff. If it's the video I'm thinking of from earlier today, the video you're going to see up front is going to make your day. Let's go to the kickoff and let's see how it plays.
FBI leaked phone call with Obama and Trump.
And that's where I see America's future.
Okay, yeah, you made some good points. But let me ask you a real question, a serious question.
Go ahead, shoot.
Okay, do you think it's weird to cup your own farts and smell them?
Donald, only weird people don't cup their own farts and smell them.
Exactly. Well, I did it the other day, and Melania looked at me like she looks at the caged alien in the White House basement. I'm thinking, listen, lady, you come from a backwater swamp from Europe. Your people still eat bugs and live in mud huts. What the hell do you know?
Well, I got one word for that, Donald.
What's that?
Women.
Well, yeah.
Women, my man.
Yeah, well, that's why I never liked Hillary. A stuck-up pig like her doesn't drop dirty dusters. Never. Not in a million years. Not happening.
I gotta stop you there.
Go ahead.
Well, Hillary has one of the dankest fart boxes in the game.
You're lying.
I'm not. I swear on Michelle's hatred for fat kids. Put it this way. If she was in office, we would be calling it the Brown House. I mean, we're talking real bombs over Baghdad.
Wow, really?
It's like she came, she farted, and I died.
Wow, who would have thought fat loser Hillary is a real fart Frankenstein?
Yeah, well, I gotta wrap this up, Donald. I got a meeting with the DNC to figure out how we're gonna take out Joe.
Just shove him in a room with a Matlock marathon. You'll never hear from him again.
Hey, not a bad idea. Well, I'll see you next week at the child sacrifice.
Okay, see you then, Barack.
Well, take care and hail Satan.
Hail Satan.
It's like the AI knew that it needed to add the Hail Satan to make that conversation more believable.
Do you feel guilty about buying online courses and never finishing them? Do you want to learn high-value skills that will set you up for success in life? Then look no further than Autonomy. With our dynamic learning environment, you'll get weekly lectures, group Q&As, and integration exercises, all guided by our Autonomy navigator, Richard Grove. Our community forum allows you to interact with like-minded individuals and build lasting friendships and business partnerships. And don't forget our monthly student-run events and Do It Live podcast, where you'll get structure, support, and feedback to gain the experience for your own podcast. So what are you waiting for? Take the next step and join Autonomy today. Season 9 starts March 17th. Take the obstacle course and enroll now.